She kept her baby brother alive with nothing but grit and a pot of cold coffee, until a stranger with a scar showed up at dawn. Out on the Wyoming range, when loneliness gnawed at the rafters and the wind wouldn't let go, a young girl held her baby brother through winters that threatened to swallow them whole. Fate didn't arrive with a cry, but with the steady hoofbeats of a silent stranger, carrying secrets cut deep as old scars. Letters from the dead, barns in flames, and trouble riding the night. By the time the dust settled, she'd learned that sometimes kindness is all that stands between a family and the dark. The wind came hard across Powder River, shoving dust and brittle sage into the slats of the old Hart Place fence. At dawn, the world wore its hunger like a ragged coat. In the small cabin, Josie Hart wrapped a faded quilt tight around her baby brother Nate and pressed the back of her hand to his brow. Heat burned beneath his skin, and the only sound was the raw, rasping hitch of the child's breath. The potbelly stove in the corner was cold as the grave. No wood left, not even enough for coffee. Josie's boots, cracked and worn thin at the soles, waited by the door. She went barefoot, every board in the floor cold as a creek stone. It was the third day of fever, and the boy's cries had grown small and bird-like. She whispered to him, though her voice sounded strange, like it belonged to someone much older. She laid him back in the willow cradle Reed had woven last winter, before the accident on the trail, and the bitter cough took him from them both. She tried to remember how her mother's hands used to comfort a feverish child, but memory was a slippery thing. She only managed a clumsy tuck of the blanket, a gentle hush in the dim light. Josie glanced at the cupboard. Bare. The water bucket was empty, rim-stained red from years of dust. She needed water, and the only well stood 200 yards out past the cottonwoods, where the frost still gripped the grass and the wind cut sharp enough to steal the air from your chest. She pulled Reed's old coat around her, jammed her feet into the boots, and stepped out onto the porch. Her toes went numb before she reached the well. The prairie stretched in every direction, silent and watching. The sky was the color of cold steel, and every step kicked up a little more ache in her bones. When she reached the well, she set the bucket down and wrapped both hands around the frozen crank. She'd done this so many times she could do it blind, but today the rope jerked in protest, stubborn as a mule. Halfway through the draw, the sound stopped her. Hooves, not fast, not urgent, just steady, measured, like a man with nowhere he had to be. Josie's grip tightened on the crank, heart banging against her ribs. Out here, a rider meant trouble more often than help. She kept her back straight, watching as the horse appeared through a stand of bitterbrush. The man in the saddle sat, tall, shoulders wide beneath a dust-caked duster. His hat rode low, shadowing half his face, but the set of his jaw, scarred and square, said he was the type who'd outlast the land, not bend to it. He said nothing. Just let the horse come to a slow halt 10 yards from the well. Josie drew herself up, voice steady as she could make it. If you're looking for someone, they're not here. Still, he didn't speak. She wanted to believe her words would send him on, but in this country, hope didn't buy much. She added, "Ain't nothing worth stealing but a sick baby and a few bad memories. You best keep moving." The wind rose between them, carrying the dry whine of fence wire straining in the distance. The man swung down from the saddle with a deliberate slowness, taller than she expected, built like a barn post, solid, silent, and all shadows. He took off his hat, letting the wind ruffle hair gone silver at the temples, then looked her straight in the eye with a pair of gray eyes that didn't give anything away, except maybe they'd seen more sorrow than most. He reached inside his coat and drew out a battered envelope, holding it up but not stepping closer. His voice came out rough, ground down by years of disuse. "Name's Whit McCullough. Got a letter for Josie Hart. Says to bring it straight no matter what." Josie swallowed, cold crawling up her arms. She'd heard that name once, whispered between her brother and a neighbor, long before the world got small and dangerous. Her legs wanted to buckle, but she stood her ground, fingers curling tighter around the crank. You his friend? No, ma'am, just owed him. He held the letter out, and Josie hesitated only a heartbeat before snatching it from his hand. She turned and ran for the house, boots slipping on the frozen mud, the letter clenched so tight it nearly tore. Behind her, Whit didn't move. He just waited, one hand resting on the saddle horn, the other hanging loose at his side. Inside, Josie dropped the bucket by the door and slid the bolt home. Her breath came hard. Little Nate whimpered from the cradle, too weak even to cry. Josie pressed the letter flat against the table, staring at the handwriting. Her brother's, no doubt, lines jagged and hurried. For a moment she didn't open it. The world felt too thin, too sharp for bad news. But the wind rattled the window, and outside the silent rancher didn't leave. With shaking fingers, Josie tore the envelope open. The words inside were few, but heavy enough to settle in her chest like a stone. If this reaches you, I ain't coming home. Trust Whit McCullough if you can. Don't judge by words, judge by what he does. Keep Nate safe. I love you. Read. Josie closed her eyes, fighting the sting behind them. The house felt emptier for every letter she read, every goodbye she tried to ignore. She tucked the note inside the pocket of her skirt and went to check on Nate, pressing a damp rag to his head, listening to the wind and waiting for something, anything, to change. Outside, Whit McCullough stood silent as a post, his shadow stretching long across the frozen dirt, as if he had always been part of the land, and always would be. Night fell early and bitter over Hart Place. The fire in the stove caught slow, thin as the hope Josie tried to keep alive. She sat beside the cradle, dabbing Nate's sweat-slicked brow with the corner of an old pillowcase, counting each shallow breath. The fever would not break. She wished for her mother's soft hands, her brother's strong arms, but the only company was the empty hush of a prairie winter and the cry of coyotes far off in the coulees. She had not slept, not really, since the fever started. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Reed, his face drawn, hands rough from building the willow cradle, laughing at the edge of the porch. She'd wake to find only cold and the small life she could not lose. The old quilt wrapped around Nate still smelled of wood smoke and hay, a memory of easier times. On the battered table, Reed's letter lay open. Josie read it again, lips barely moving. Trust Whit McCullough if you can. Don't judge by words. Judge by what he does. Outside, footsteps thumped softly across the frozen porch boards. She tensed, fingers closing around a fire poker. A slow knock, then a pause. No threat, just patience. Josie cracked the door. Whit stood there, face unreadable, eyes tracing the line of her jaw, as if searching for something he'd misplaced years ago. Without a word, he handed her a bundle of kindling. A moment later, he was at the woodpile, splitting logs, sleeves rolled, each swing a steady, silent promise. Josie watched from behind the half-closed door. There was a loneliness to his work, as if he chopped not just wood, but the distance between two strangers stranded by fate. Inside, the warmth crept back. Josie checked the cupboards, bare except for a little cornmeal and salt. She made a thin porridge, barely enough for one, but fed it all to Nate. The boy's eyes opened, glazed and bright, searching for comfort. Josie sang an old song, one her mother used to hum, voice breaking on the high notes. The next morning, Whit returned, silent again. He carried a sack, cornmeal and dried beans, a flask of bitter coffee. He fixed the loose hinge on the barn door, patched a gap in the window, stacked the rest of the wood neatly beside the stove. Never spoke more than a handful of words. Josie studied him, wary, but Reed's letter echoed in her mind. Judge by what he does. Late afternoon brought more trouble. Hoofbeats thundered down the lane, a rider in a county coat, dust rising like a storm behind him. Josie stepped out, shoulders squared, Nate's thin cries muffled by the blanket on her chest. The man dismounted, handed her an official paper. The seal bled red across the top. Notice of foreclosure. Unless a legal male guardian claims this land within 14 days, it reverts to the county. He didn't look at her, didn't see the ache in her arms or the fire in her eyes. Just another form, another farm to seize. Josie bit her lip, nodded, and held Nate tighter. When the rider left, Josie leaned against the porch rail, every muscle shaking. The world, she thought, had a way of pushing until you could not breathe. Whit stood in the yard, watching the county man ride away. He met Josie's gaze, steady, silent. Inside, the kitchen felt smaller, as if the walls themselves could hear the county's verdict. Josie laid the paper beside Reed's letter, the black words a fresh wound across the page. She wanted to scream, to rage, but there was no one to hear but the baby, and he needed calm more than anything. She poured what was left of the coffee into a tin cup, hands trembling. Out the window, Whit hammered new boards across the coop, never once asking if she needed help, never waiting for thanks. The wind picked up, rattling the panes, tugging at the patched quilt on the bed. Josie watched the silent rancher and wondered how much trust could be built on the work of two scarred hands. As dusk fell, Josie sat by the cradle, whispering old promises. She would keep this land, she told Nate, even if it took every breath, every day she had left. The stove ticked and groaned. Reed's letter, the county notice, the weight of all that was lost and all she could still lose. All of it hung in the darkness, and Josie Hart did not close her eyes. Outside, Whit McCullough moved through the night, quiet as snowfall, hard as frost. The days thinned into themselves, gray and sharp as the wind off the open range. Josie kept count by the sun's slow crawl along the floorboards and the way Nate's breath turned ragged in the cold. There was no room for hope, only the quiet, stubborn ache of survival. Each morning she woke before dawn. The cellar was nearly bare. She scraped what was left of the cornmeal into a tin pot, cooked it down to mush, and spooned it into Nate's mouth as he fussed and coughed. The stove stayed lit now, thanks to Whit's woodpile, but the air still bit at her wrists and nose. Sometimes the silence in the cabin was so thick it felt like another mouth to feed. Outside, the world paid no mind. The prairie grass bent low, dust gathering in the yard, the wind forever chasing itself across the fence line. Once Josie glimpsed a hawk circling above the cottonwoods, broad wings tilting to the sun. She watched it until it vanished, wishing she could remember how it felt to be anything but trapped. Whit kept his distance. He worked the way some men pray, head bowed, lips tight, arms steady. He patched the chicken coop, mended a length of fence, brought a sack of flour to the porch and left it there, not waiting to be seen. Some evenings, Josie heard him humming quietly as he sharpened a knife or checked the shoes on his horse. It was a tune she almost recognized, something mournful from another time. Still, trust came slow. Josie watched him from behind curtains, wary as a stray dog, but Reed's words held her steady. Judge by what he does. On the third day, as dusk crept across the land and the cold pressed deeper into the seams of the house, a rider from the county showed again. This time he brought a second notice, shorter, angrier, stamped with a fresh red seal. Deadlines moved up, he said, not meeting her eyes. 10 days, not 14. Judge says the law's changed. No man on the deed, no land. Josie nodded, biting back the sting in her throat. The man looked past her, gaze lingering on the thin smoke from the stove, the cracked glass in the window, and maybe, just for a second, the fierce way she squared her shoulders. But he left all the same, dust rising behind his horse like a second, meaner storm. That night, Josie sat at the table with her head in her hands. The paper lay in front of her, the ink already smudged by sweat and the faint trace of a tear. Nate whimpered in the cradle, and Whit's boots thudded on the porch. He didn't knock, just stood there in the chill. She opened the door a crack. He held up a sack. Dried apples, salt pork, a can of beans. His eyes, pale gray and steady, did not flinch. "They mean to take it?" he asked. Josie nodded, the words stuck behind her teeth. Whit set the sack on the table, turned and walked back into the dark, the wind swallowing the space between them. For a long time Josie stood with her hand on the latch, listening to the night. Nothing but wind, her own heart beating out the truth she'd known since Reed's funeral. No one was coming to save her. 2 days later, a neighbor, Mrs. Alma Pike, stopped by with a jar of preserves and a worried look. She pressed Josie's hand and whispered, "Ain't nobody owes you anything but kindness." Josie managed a smile, though her bones felt hollow. Folks in Ash Bluff didn't visit much. Hard times made neighbors turn inward, counting their own debts. Even so, rumors traveled faster than stagecoaches. She'd seen the way people glanced at Whit in town, how some crossed the street, how others whispered that he'd once rode with a posse that did more harm than good. Whit never answered those stares. He just tipped his hat and kept moving. That evening, as Josie counted her last few coins and tried to stretch them into more days, she found a small sack left by the door, cornbread and jerky, still warm. No note, no thanks expected. Only the mark of a man who believed action spoke better than words. The wind howled outside, rattling the tin roof. Josie sat on the bed, Nate bundled in her lap, and watched the shadows stretch long across the floor. Each day the world took a little more. Each night she held tighter to what remained. On the table, the county notice bled red beneath the lamp, days running out like water through her hands. Outside, Whit stood at the fence line, silent as the moon, the prairie wind tugging at his coat. Morning came raw and gray, the kind that pressed the world flat. Josie watched the dawn creep across the window, the sky bruised with cold. Nate slept beside her, breath thin but steady, a small comfort in a house that felt more hollow every day. Whit appeared at first light, shoulders hunched against the wind, arms full of chopped wood. He didn't knock. He never did, just set the wood by the stove, eyes moving over the room, quiet, measuring like he could see every cracked board, every empty shelf, every hope running thin. Josie nodded once in thanks, then busied herself with the kettle, pretending she wasn't counting every stick of wood, every spoon of flour. The days blurred together, Whit working in silence, Josie tending to Nate, fighting back the fear that grew with every tick of the clock. Sometimes she caught Whit studying her, eyes shadowed with something like regret, but he said nothing, and she didn't ask. That afternoon, Whit came in, boots muddy, hat in hand. He stood by the door, waiting until Josie met his gaze. "I spoke to Reverend Whitfield," he said, voice low as gravel. "Asked about guardianship. There's a way, if I'm family, husband." The word sat heavy in the air. Josie felt her hands go still, the world narrowing to the sound of Nate's breathing and the soft ticking of the stove. "I don't owe you that," she said finally, anger and fear tangled in her chest. Whit shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, but the law's the law. They won't listen to you. Not out here. They'll listen to a man's name on a deed." He stared at the floor, boots worn smooth. "Ain't right, but it's true." Josie's mind reeled. Marry a stranger, trust a man with scars and silence, all because Reed was gone and the world made rules she couldn't change. She looked at Nate, cheeks flushed with fever, tiny hand wrapped in the hem of her skirt. Sometimes survival was a choice made with fists, not feelings. Whit waited, saying nothing. Finally, Josie nodded once, sharp as a knife. If it's the only way. That night, under the flicker of a single oil lamp, Reverend Whitfield stood in their kitchen, hands shaking as he flipped through a battered Bible. Mrs. Alma Pike stood witness, a soft smile hiding her worry. Whit pressed a ring into Josie's palm, a rough circle of horseshoe, bent and hammered smooth, the metal warm from his hand. No vows of love, no talk of forever, just a name signed in ink and a promise spoken through action. Afterward, Whit lay on a narrow cot by the window, boots still on, eyes fixed on the darkness. Josie lay on the bed with Nate, back turned, listening to the silence stretch between them. It was not peace, but it was enough. For tonight, the house held. When Reverend Whitfield and Mrs. Pike left, Alma lingered at the door, voice low. Whit keeps a room ready every winter, fixes it up nice. Used to belong to someone, Evelyn Pike. She's gone now, but he keeps it waiting, just in case. Josie shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of things left unsaid. Wind rattled the windows. Somewhere outside, a coyote cried, lonely and sharp. Josie turned, looked at the horseshoe ring glinting in the lamplight. She slipped it onto her finger, the fit strange but sure, and closed her eyes. In the hush that followed, it seemed even the prairie held its breath. A storm moved through in the night, leaving the world washed raw. Josie woke to the smell of wet sage and the distant sound of cattle bawling down in the low draw. Nate was sleeping easier now. She could tell by the slow rise and fall of his chest, the way his little fist uncurled from the blanket. She pressed a kiss to his brow and slipped from bed. The yard was all mud and standing water. Josie pulled her coat close and stepped onto the porch, boots sinking into the ground as she crossed toward the barn. That's when she saw it, a single boot print pressed deep in the muck by the corral. Too big for her, too wide for Whit. She crouched, tracing the print with a fingertip, the chill running straight to her heart. Whit was already up, working the fence line, his silhouette hard against the gray sky. Josie waved him over, silent but urgent. He knelt beside her, eyes narrowing as he took in the print. "Not yours," she said. "No, ma'am." Whit stood, scanning the horizon, body tensed like a man expecting trouble. By noon, the sign of trespass was everywhere. A hinge on the barn door twisted. The branding iron moved out of place, a faint whiff of kerosene lingering in the straw. Whit went quiet, colder than before. He checked the rifles, sharpened his old knife, and left a lantern burning by the door long after sunset. That evening, Running Crane came through, his pony stepping careful around the puddles. He was a crow hunter, old friend of Whit's, his voice low as riverbed stones. He knelt by the boot print, eyes distant. "Whoever this is, they move like someone counting every step. Ain't in a hurry. Watching for something." Josie asked. "You think they'll come back?" Running Crane met her gaze, unreadable. "A man who comes at night leaves no mark but one boot. He wants to be seen, but not caught." As dusk fell, the air grew thick with the threat of rain. Whit hung the branding iron over the fire, face blank but hands tense. Josie watched him, trying to read the storm behind his eyes. Just after midnight, as the wind screamed through the cottonwoods, Josie checked the windows and doors one last time. There, carved into the frame above the threshold, she found a single letter. T, slanted, deep, the wood still raw. She backed away, pulse hammering, and called softly for Whit. He came quick, rifle in hand, eyes sharp with old memory. He touched the carving, lips pressed tight. "Tate Hollis," he murmured, "he's found us." Josie didn't ask how Whit knew, didn't ask what it meant. She only watched as he settled by the door, Winchester across his knees, a man ready to stand his ground. Later, long after the fire burned low, Josie lay awake, listening to the soft drip of rain from the eaves and the distant howl of a lone wolf. In her mind, she saw the boot print, the branding iron, the fresh-cut letter, all signs of something dark circling closer, a shadow cast by old sins. The night pressed heavy on the roof. For a moment Josie wondered if courage was nothing more than waking up again and again to meet whatever waited on the other side of the dawn. The wind snapped colder that night, bringing with it a sky full of bruised clouds and a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. Josie woke to the sound of Nate's scream. Raw and terrified, she scrambled from the bed, heart already racing, but it wasn't fever this time. The air was thick with the stench of smoke. A glow flickered against the window. Josie swept Nate into her arms and ran for the porch, the cold biting her bare feet. Out by the east barn, flames climbed fast, chewing through dry wood and blackening the sky. The animals screamed, Dolly the mule bucking in her pen, chickens scattering in panic. Whit was already running, boots pounding mud, his coat flaring behind him like the wing of some wild thing. Without a word, he yanked open the barn door, ducking beneath the roaring timbers. Josie stood rooted, clutching Nate, every muscle screaming to help, to do something, but her legs wouldn't move. A shadow stepped from the trees, tall and sharp as a knife. He wore a battered hat, coat dark as river rock, eyes glinting cold under the brim. Josie's breath caught. Tate Hollis. He raised a hand in greeting, casual as Sunday morning. "Didn't come for the barn," he drawled, "but a man's got to send a message." Josie's hands shook as she shifted Nate to her left hip. Free hand groping for the Winchester Reed had left behind the door. She leveled the rifle, voice shaking. "Get off my land." Tate's smile twisted. "Ain't looking for you, missy. Came for the one hiding in your shadows." Josie's finger tightened on the trigger. The fire behind Tate cast his shadow long across the yard. Whit stumbled from the barn, coughing, shirt scorched, cradling Dolly's halter in one hand. Tate nodded toward him. "You gonna keep running, Whit, or you finally ready to settle what you owe?" Whit's eyes narrowed, but he kept the mule steady, one hand never leaving the rope. He didn't answer. Tate's gaze flicked to Josie. "You Hart's girl?" He was a good man, didn't deserve what came for him. His voice hardened. "But your new friend there, he owes blood for blood." The wind shifted, blowing a wave of sparks over the yard. Josie saw Whit's jaw tighten, saw the truth in his silence. She lifted the rifle, steadier now. "You set one more foot closer, you'll answer to me." Tate laughed dry and hollow, hand brushing the butt of his pistol. In a blur, Josie fired. The shot cracked the night, splintering wood by Tate's boot. He stepped back, teeth bared in a wolf's grin. "Sharp little girl," he spat. "This ain't over. I'll take what's owed, law or no law." He faded into the trees, the fire licking after him. Whit staggered over, soot streaked across his face, breath rough. He knelt, reaching for Nate, then pulled Josie close, just for a moment, just enough to steady them both. The barn's roof caved, sending up a pillar of sparks. Josie buried her face in Whit's shoulder, Nate trembling between them. Behind the ruined barn, the prairie wind carried the scent of kerosene and ash. It would be a long night before the dawn. Morning rose dim behind smoke-stained windows. Josie watched the barn smolder, eyes raw and sleepless. The wind had changed overnight. Ash clung to every sill, every fold of her dress. Nate coughed, a small dry sound, but his fever had broken. Small mercy in a world full of wounds. Whit moved through the ruins, face drawn, silent. His hands shook when he ran them over Dolly's coat, but he said nothing. Josie kept her distance, arms around Nate, gaze fixed on the tracks left in the churned mud. One set leading east, deeper into the wild. After breakfast, Whit sat at the table, hat in his lap, staring into the cold fire. He slid a slip of paper toward Josie, a name and address in Haven Ford, the old neighbor Alma Pike's place. "If I don't come back, you take Nate there," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Don't wait for me. Don't wait for trouble." Josie felt her anger rise tight in her throat. "You mean to go after him alone?" Whit's jaw set. "Some debts don't leave you be. Best you know who to trust." He left before noon, packing only a saddlebag, the Winchester, and his silence. Josie watched him ride out, the shape of him swallowed by the hills and cottonwoods. She pressed the address into her apron pocket, heart pounding in a way that felt like breaking and hardening at the same time. But she couldn't sit and wait. Nate slept against her chest, wrapped tight in a shawl. She hitched Dolly, soot still clinging to the mule's back, and set off along the old arroyo, keeping low where the sage grew thick. The world felt bigger, meaner, more dangerous than ever before, but Josie's fear was a hard thing, cold and unyielding. Clouds piled overhead, threatening rain. By late afternoon, the trail narrowed to a cut in the earth, known as Devil's Draw, steep, stony, lined with cottonwood shadows. Josie found the first sign there, a smear of blood on white rock, Whit's hat mashed and muddy beside the path. She slipped from Dolly's back, heart drumming in her ears. Down in the draw she heard voices, 2 men, one calm, one ragged with pain. She kept low, cradling Nate, and crept to the edge of the rocks. Whit was there, hands tied behind a cottonwood, one eye swollen, mouth set in a hard line. Facing him, pistol in hand, stood Tate Hollis, coat ripped, boots caked in mud, eyes wild. Tate spat into the dust, his voice low and bitter. "You ever think you could outlive what we did?" Tate said, the words like gravel. "Or just outwait it?" Whit didn't answer, blood dripping from his lip. Josie moved, slow as dusk, wrapping Nate in a blanket and tucking him behind a fallen log. Her fingers found the rifle, Reed's Winchester, heavy and cold. She set up a dummy, her shawl and some rocks, then tossed it, hard, into the brush. Tate whirled, fired at the motion, and Josie squeezed the trigger from cover. Her shot cracked, shattering the air, grazing Tate's arm. He cursed, spun, but Josie was gone, circling wide through the brush. She reached Whit as Tate staggered, his blood bright on his sleeve. Whit's voice was a whisper, "Go! Get Nate!" "Not without you," Josie hissed, sawing at his ropes with the edge of her knife. Whit slumped, half falling into her arms as she dragged him behind the cottonwood. Tate limped back, eyes crazed, gun raised, but Whit snatched Josie's hand, steady as ever, and fired her rifle from the hip. Tate dove, the bullet missing by an inch. The vigilante scrambled up the draw, disappearing into the gathering storm. Josie dragged Whit to Dolly, boosting him into the saddle, tying Nate to her chest with a strip of her apron. They rode out, battered and shaking, as the first cold drops of rain fell. Behind them, the Devil's Draw closed quiet as a grave. Ahead, home waited, scarred but still standing. They reached Hart Place at dusk, both of them limping, mud splattered on their boots, the rain soaking through Josie's hair. Whit barely made it from the saddle to the porch. Josie hauled him inside, laid him on the old settee, and pressed a wet rag to his temple. Nate, worn out and hungry, whimpered but did not cry. The storm outside pounded the roof, thunder rolling low and close. Josie moved through the night on tired legs, lighting the stove, boiling water, washing blood from Whit's brow. He said little. His breath rattled in his chest, eyes closed against the pain. She fed Nate by lantern light, then sat beside Whit as he drifted in and out of restless sleep. At first light, a sharp metallic snap cracked the air. Josie woke, heart stuttering. She grabbed the Winchester and hurried to the porch. The yard was still, muddy, quiet, but different. Something was waiting. Down by the barn, the steel jaws of a trap stood sprung, teeth bared and empty. No animal caught, but a scrap of cloth, wits, hung torn on the teeth. She shivered. There were boot prints everywhere, pressed deep into the muck, some leading away towards the cottonwoods. Wit, pale but standing, hobbled out to meet her, his arm bound with a strip of flannel. "He's setting snares," he said. "Not just for us, for anyone." Josie's hands shook. She stared at the barn, half-burned, doors swinging loose on a hinge. "He won't stop, will he?" Wit didn't answer, only checked the Winchester, wiped it down, and loaded each shell with slow, practiced care. "He's hunting the names that let the law turn sour. My name's on his list." Josie set her jaw, anger mixing with fear. "Well, he'll have to get past both of us." Late in the day, as the rain thinned and the sun bled through the clouds, Josie found a scrap of paper nailed to the barn, ink smeared, words barely legible. "Ash Bluff hides men in black coats. Justice won't wait." She tore it down, hands numb. Inside, Wit sat by the stove, carving a fresh stock for the rifle. Nate gurgled in his cradle, soothed by the sound of wood shaving hitting the floor. Josie read the note, voice low, anger tightening every syllable. "He's not just after you, Wit. He wants the whole town to pay." Wit's eyes met hers, hard as hammered iron. "Then he'll have to start here." The wind rose that night, carrying the scent of wet earth and burned timber. Josie bolted the door, checked every window, and settled Nate against her chest. Wit stood guard by the fire, silent, a rifle across his knees. Out in the dark, the world circled tight. Each breath was a prayer, each hour another test. And still, somewhere beyond the fence, Tate Hollis waited, counting every step. Morning brought a hush across the prairie, a pause before the next blow. Josie bundled Nate in a wool shawl and walked the 2 miles into Ash Bluff, boots sticky with mud, her mind fixed on the names Tate had carved into their world. The town was changed since the last winter. Shopfronts shabbier, eyes sharper, voices lower. She stopped by Mrs. Alma Pike's kitchen first, dropping off a basket of eggs for the preserves Mrs. Pike had traded last week. Alma pressed a hand to Josie's cheek, searching her face for truths too heavy to say aloud. "You hold on, honey. Sometimes all a body can do is stand." In the mercantile, Josie bought flour and lamp oil, counting her coins slow. The young Pinkerton, Silas Hale, loitered by the shelf of canned peaches, his coat too clean, his shoes too new for prairie dust. He watched Josie, always with that polite smile that seemed to slice through every silence. "Ma'am," Silas nodded, "just looking to help folks stay safe. Lot of rumors these days. You see or hear anything out of place?" Josie met his gaze, steady and cold. "Out here, sir, trouble comes on the wind. When it does, we deal with it." He tipped his hat, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Let me know if that changes." Outside, the sun glared off the jailhouse roof, a line of horses tied out front. Sheriff Abner Stroud stood by the boardwalk, one hand resting on his holster, the other tracing a line in the dust with his boot. He nodded to Josie, gray mustache twitching. "Word is, someone's hunting old ghosts. Folks whisper about Wit, but I remember him as a man who paid his debts. If you need the law, you come straight." Josie nodded, but her mouth stayed shut. The law here knew how to keep secrets, but secrets always found their way back in the end. As Josie headed home, Running Crane waited by the gate, arms folded, eyes on the horizon. "Your enemy's shadow is longer than he is. Don't mistake him for a ghost. Men bleed like any other animal." Wit was on the porch, sharpening a chisel when Josie returned. She sat beside him in the creaking silence, Nate drowsing in her lap. Wit wiped his hands, stared out at the low hills, jaw tight. Josie's voice broke the quiet. "Why did you stay here, Wit?" when you could have run. He shrugged. Some things don't run no matter what chases them. That night, Silas Hale arrived with a photograph, edges singed, faces lost to smoke. He slid it across the table, his smile finally gone. Found this in the sheriff's files. That's Judge Beaumont before the fire. These are the names Tate wants. You and yours are caught in the middle, whether you like it or not. Josie studied the photograph, feeling the burn of old sorrow and fresh dread. Whit leaned over, silent, but his fingers touched hers, light as dust, heavy as promise. Running Crane's words echoed through the night as the oil lamp guttered. Even a shadow must stand somewhere. Morning would bring more reckoning, but tonight they watched the lamplight flicker and tried to remember what hope felt like. The clouds rolled in heavy that morning, hanging low and sullen over the prairie. Rain began as a whisper, then battered the land with a force that turned the roads to thick mud. Every rut a trap for careless feet. Josie watched from the porch, feeling the old dread press down. Some storms, she'd learned, were more than weather. Whit buckled his coat and checked the Winchester. "We ride today," he said, voice tight. "Beaumont's on Tate's list. He won't wait for a trial." Josie cinched Nate tight to her chest and climbed up beside Whit on Dolly, the three of them wrapped in oilcloth and worry. They rode slow, keeping to the edge of the cottonwoods, the rain running in rivers down their faces. By the time they reached Red Hollow, the world was a churned mess. The air stank of mud and dying grass. Thunder crackling far off. Whit pulled up, hand raised. Something glittered beneath the weeds ahead. Too bright, too wrong for prairie ground. Josie's breath caught. "Spike trap," she whispered, pointing. "Someone set for blood, not game." Whit slid from the saddle, moving careful, brushing away wet grass. The iron teeth gnashed together as he prodded them with a stick, snapping shut with a sound that cut through the rain. They detoured, circling the edge of the hollow. By the time they reached the old judge's house, smoke was already curling from the roof. Flames licked the eaves, the windows burned bright in the gloom. Whit leapt from Dolly, but Josie held him back. The fire was too strong. Neighbors gathered, buckets in hand, faces twisted by fear and blame. Inside, the house collapsed. A sheriff's deputy found the judge on the parlor floor, a gunshot to the chest, the smell of kerosene thick as death. Nailed to the doorframe was a sheet of paper, soaked in rain and blood. One word in a shaking hand, "Paid." Sheriff Stroud arrived, rain sheeting off his hat brim. His jaw was clenched, voice low. "This is no accident. Someone's making a reckoning. Town's going to tear itself apart." As the fire burned, Josie caught sight of Silas Hale, Pinkerton coat plastered to his back. He sidled up, voice pitched low. "You're not just following footsteps, ma'am. Someone's leading you straight to the edge." Whit squared his shoulders, eyes hard as flint. "We make our own way, sir. No man pulls my strings." Hale's smile flickered, almost a warning. "Be sure you know the difference." The rain eased as evening fell, but the air was thick with the smell of smoke and fear. Josie held Nate close, watching the flames chew up what was left of Beaumont's house. The sky above Ash Bluff glowed an angry red. On the ride home, neither Josie nor Whit spoke. The mud splashed their boots. The rain washed the tears from Josie's cheeks before she could feel them fall. Tonight, the prairie was a place of reckoning. No one slept easy. No one could pretend the darkness had passed. Ash Bluff buzzed with trouble, voices thick as flies around the saloon and mercantile. Josie felt it as soon as she reached town, the way folks glanced over their shoulders, hands always hovering near coat pockets, stories turning meaner with every telling. Nate clung to her skirt, wide-eyed at the swell of men crowding the boardwalk, the sharp bark of laughter from behind swinging doors. Whit kept to himself by the wagon, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the far hills. The sheriff stood watch outside the jail, face pinched, jaw working like he chewed on some truth he'd never spit out. "Had a fire last night," someone muttered as Josie passed. "Judge gone, house nothing but a skeleton." Maybe it's that drifter woman's curse, brings nothing but bad luck. Or maybe the land itself wants something back. Josie ignored them, trading eggs and sweet corn for a sack of beans. A quiet nod from Mrs. Pike, all the comfort she'd get. Running Crane rode past the livery, eyes shadowed, offering her only a brief flicker of a smile, one survivor to another. Silas Hale, dust still clean on his Pinkerton coat, slipped from a side alley and fell in beside her. "This town's eating itself alive, ma'am. Saw a man nail a dog to a door once. Folks say it was justice. Sometimes I wonder if they know the difference." Josie said nothing, only pulled Nate closer. At home she found Whit sitting on the porch, hands bare, horseshoe ring glinting in the sunlight. She sat beside him, silence stretching between them. The prairie wind pressed its way into every crack, promising more trouble to come. Whit spoke first, voice rough. "You know I keep a room ready every year. She's never coming back. I reckon I'm done waiting." Josie looked at the ring in his palm, metal bent and battered. "You sure?" Her voice was little more than breath. He nodded, not looking at her. Rooms ain't for ghosts. That night she found her courage. When the prairie fell dark and the crickets began to sing, she stepped outside, lantern swinging, and called Tate's name into the night. No answer, only the echo of her own voice across the open fields. Inside, Josie placed the horseshoe ring in the center of her palm, squeezing it tight until the iron left a mark. Whit watched from the window, silent as always, but something in the set of his shoulders told her he'd chosen too. Tonight they'd face whatever darkness came, not with words, but with the quiet strength that comes from holding steady when every other soul would run. The night before brought no answer, only wind and the long hush of the fields. At dawn, the prairie wore a shroud of pale fog, the air heavy with the promise of another reckoning. Josie saddled Dolly and rode out with Whit at her side, Running Crane trailing like a second shadow. Nate stayed with Mrs. Pike, tucked safe under quilts that smelled of sage and apple peel. They followed the old chalk ridge, a scar of white stone cutting through the sagebrush, haunted by broken fence posts and memories. The sun barely broke the horizon when Tate Hollis stepped from behind a boulder, shoulders hunched, hat low, pistol holstered but not forgotten. His eyes were burned out, tired, hollow, all the fury boiled down to embers. Josie slid from her mule, boots crunching the dry grass, her breath sharp in her chest. "You came into my house," she said, voice steady. "You left a mark, but you never took more than a night's sleep. Why?" Tate looked at the sky, jaw clenched. "You think I want this? A man can only watch the world rot so long before he turns to digging graves." Whit stayed back, rifle low, silent as thunderclouds. Running Crane didn't move at all, but Josie felt his presence, weighty and calm, a silent witness to the edge they all walked. Josie stepped closer, close enough to see the trembling in Tate's hands. "My brother's all I got. I'm not giving him to your ghosts." For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind dropped, carrying only the distant cry of a hawk. Tate's voice, when it came, was rough with regret. "I ain't here for children or widows." He let his gun fall to the dirt, knees folding until he crouched low. "I'm tired, Josie, tired of chasing what's already lost." Whit's shadow fell across them both, broad and quiet. "You want peace, Tate. You gotta put your trust in folks still breathing." Tate shook his head, but his fight was spent. Don't ask forgiveness. Just put me in the hands of a man who ain't afraid to judge right from wrong." Josie reached out, took his cold hand in her own, steady as bedrock. The sun crested the ridge, gold and thin, brushing light over the three of them, each scarred, each holding something they could never give back. Tate's voice was just a whisper. "I'll go quiet if you'll have it." She nodded. "We'll walk together." Whit led them down the ridge, Running Crane flanking, silent as dusk. No victory, no cheers, just the heavy breath of men and women too stubborn to let the world have the last word. By the time they reached Ash Bluff, Tate walked willingly, wrists bound but head high, every step the end of a long, lonesome road. The jail at Ash Bluff was little more than a box of gray stone and rusted bars, cold even as the prairie sun crept up the street. Sheriff Stroud waited by the door, his old hat pressed firm to his brow, eyes tired but unflinching. When Tate arrived, flanked by Whit and Josie, there was no anger, only the slow, weary nod of a man who had seen too much to be surprised anymore. Tate stepped inside on his own, no struggle. He lowered himself to the cot, staring at his open hands. Josie looked at him, saw the lines that ran deep, the way grief cut a man hollow. Whit said nothing but lingered in the hallway, broad shoulders blocking out the sun for just a moment. Stroud locked the door with a sharp click. "No lynch mob, no night justice. He'll see the judge when the circuit comes through. That's law enough for me." Word spread. The townsfolk came slow, some gawking, some whispering, but none dared spit or curse. Maybe they'd all had their own brush with the edge of sorrow, or maybe the sight of Tate, head bowed, hands still, made them remember how close any life could come to breaking. Silas Hale, the Pinkerton, appeared at noon, boots shining, coat pressed. He laid a worn list on the sheriff's desk. Names, places, dates, the kind of accounting that never lets a man sleep easy. Beside each name, a mark, Judge Beaumont crossed out, Deputy Malloy circled in red, Banker Sutter underlined twice. "More will fall," Silas said, his tone hard but not unkind. "But maybe they'll answer for it before the prairie takes them." Stroud nodded, jaw clenched. "This town will answer to itself, Pinkerton. Not to men who ride in for justice and ride out with nothing but bones." As the days passed, quiet arrests swept through Ash Bluff. A deputy slipped out of town on the morning train, leaving a trail of "I owe us." Banker Sutter was caught burning papers behind his barn at dawn, eyes wild, voice rambling. The council, once so sure, sat silent through every town meeting, faces pale and small. Josie and Whit rebuilt what they could. The barn was half raised, every beam carved with care, each nail hammered by a hand that had lost more than it ever gained. Nate toddled between them, sticky with dust, giggling as he tried to carry more than he could hold. One evening, as the sun bled low across the fields, Josie found a small parcel at their door. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, was a child's tin star, dented and worn, and a note in Tate's hard, careful script. "Don't let the boy forget the sky is bigger than hate." The words were few, but Josie felt them settle deep, like seed in good earth. She hung the tin star above Nate's bed, where the last gold light of day caught it and set it shining, soft, simple, honest as hope. For the first time in a long while, the house felt whole. The walls still remembered sorrow, but the rooms filled with the warmth of breath and laughter, the slow, steady work of living. Outside, the prairie stretched wide, the wind singing low, and for a moment, all the old ghosts stayed quiet. A year passed like a slow wagon across the prairie, one creaking board at a time, one sun-baked morning after another. The scars of fire faded in the grass. The new barn stood solid and proud, smelling of fresh pine and sweat. Hart Place was never rich, but it grew steady. Beans and squash in the garden, eggs in the basket, coffee on the stove most mornings without needing to scrape the old grounds. Whit moved slower these days, his limp more pronounced after last winter, but his hands remained sure. Some afternoons Josie would find him at the far end of the house, sanding the doorframe of a small spare room. The window overlooked the green sweep of pasture, the bed always made, the air clean and waiting. He caught her looking one morning, sunlight slanting through the glass, dust motes dancing in the stillness. "I kept this room for someone I lost," he said, voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the house. "Used to fix it up every year, thinking maybe she'd come home. Reckon now, if you'd like, it ought to be Nate's room." Josie traced the wooden sill, nodding slow, her heart full of old ache and a gentle peace. "You don't have to forget, Whit. Some folks we carry, but if you'll stay, that's all I ask." He nodded, not trusting his voice, and pressed his palm to the back of her head, a touch both blessing and promise. Outside, Nate ran along the porch rail, the little tin star pinned to his shirt, laughter trailing after him like a banner. The sky threatened a summer storm, clouds piling high and blue. Josie watched as the first drops fell, fat and cool, dotting the dust, darkening the land. She didn't call Nate inside. She let the rain find him, watched his joy as he spun beneath the open sky. Running Crane passed through the gate, lifting a hand in silent greeting. Alma Pike brought over jars of peach preserves and a loaf of bread, her old eyes crinkling as she squeezed Josie's hand. Sheriff Stroud retired that spring, hanging his hat on a nail by the church door. Silas Hale left town with the Pinkerton train, but not before leaving a note. Some souls have served their own sentence, and that's justice enough. That evening Whit poured coffee, and they sat on the porch in the hush that follows a storm. The earth smelled rich and alive. The wind carried no bitterness, just the far-off music of frogs and distant thunder. Josie leaned against Whit, Nate asleep in her lap, the weight of a year gone by settling gentle on her shoulders. She thought of Reed, of Evelyn, of Tate, of all those who'd come and gone, leaving behind sorrow and salvation in equal measure. Whit squeezed her hand, voice rough as gravel but sure. "I ain't leaving, Josie, not while you want me here." She said nothing, just held on, letting the silence say everything the years could not. The night deepened, the house full of warmth, the past still there, but the future, for once, wide as the summer sky. And outside, the rain fell, steady and soft, carrying away the last of the old dust, leaving only the green and the promise of morning. If this story hit close to home, or reminded you of someone you once knew, drop a simple 0 or 1 down below. Sometimes the smallest words mean the most. And if you want to ride along for more true blue Western tales, go ahead and subscribe. I'd be honored to have you join us by the fire for the next story. Until then, keep holding on to what matters, folks.